A warship China's Navy did not expect anyone to associate with its most advanced weapon has just fired that weapon anyway. RETENTION CHECKPOINT. 0 o'clock hook. Verified fact, smaller hull fires hypersonic missile. According to a report from the war zone, the defense outlet known as TWZ, the Chinese Navy test-fired the YJ-20, a hypersonic anti-ship missile, from a destroyer noticeably smaller than the warships usually linked to weapons in this class. Hypersonic anti-ship missiles usually need a Navy's largest, most capable surface combatants, ships with the size, power generation, and vertical launch capacity to handle something that travels at many times the speed of sound. TWZ's reporting says this launch came from something lighter than that. That single detail is why this story matters, and it isn't because a missile was fired. Militaries test weapons constantly, and most of those tests never make international news. This one matters because of where the missile came from. RETENTION CHECKPOINT. 030 resolution Ts. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through what TWZ actually reported, what a launch like this could mean for how China plans to field its most advanced anti-ship weapons across its fleet, and what still remains analyst interpretation rather than confirmed fact. This isn't a PLA Navy press release. It's an outside assessment built on available imagery and reporting, and that distinction matters. Here's what's actually known. The report centers on the YJ-20, described as a hypersonic anti-ship missile in China's naval arsenal. Hypersonic here means a weapon capable of sustained flight above Mach 5, 5 times the speed of sound, for a significant part of its flight path, as opposed to briefly touching hypersonic speed during a terminal dive, which some conventional anti-ship missiles already do. The distinction matters for air defense. A true hypersonic cruise or glide weapon compresses the time a targeted ship's crew has to detect, track, and intercept it, sometimes down to a matter of seconds. According to TWZ's analysis, the missile was launched from a destroyer the outlet describes as smaller than the vessels usually linked to hypersonic-class weapons in Chinese service. TWZ hasn't identified the exact hull, class, or displacement of the ship involved in the reporting summarized here, and this video won't invent one. What TWZ's analysts do report is the broader implication. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, may be extending hypersonic anti-ship capability down to a wider, more numerous tier of its destroyer fleet instead of keeping it only on its largest and most expensive combatants. That's worth pausing on. If a capability like this stays confined to a handful of flagship cruisers or the largest destroyers, a rival navy can count those hulls, track them, and plan around a limited number of high-value threats. Spread the same capability across a much larger number of mid-sized destroyers, and the planning problem changes completely. Analysts watching Chinese naval developments have tracked a pattern for years. The plan keeps building large numbers of increasingly capable mid-tier warships rather than a small number of exquisite ones. A hypersonic anti-ship missile showing up on a smaller hull, if the trend holds beyond this one test, fits that pattern rather than breaks it. It's worth being precise about what hypersonic anti-ship missile means here, because the term gets thrown around loosely. China has fielded a range of anti-ship weapons over the past 2 decades. Subsonic cruise missiles, supersonic sea skimmers, and longer-range ballistic anti-ship missiles like the DF-21D and DF-26, sometimes called carrier killers in Western reporting. Those are land-based, launched from mobile transporter erector launchers well inland. A dedicated hypersonic anti-ship cruise or glide weapon launched from a surface combatant rather than a land-based or air-based platform is a different engineering problem entirely. The missile, its guidance system, and its launch platform all have to handle the thermal and structural stress of sustained hypersonic flight, and the ship needs the power and cooling to support the missile's pre-launch and targeting systems. That a smaller destroyer reportedly handled this is itself part of what makes the test notable to analysts, regardless of the missile's precise performance figures, which TWZ's reporting doesn't claim to know precisely, and which this video won't guess at either. It also helps to place this inside the wider international race toward hypersonic weapons, since China isn't the only navy chasing them. Russia has publicized its Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, meant for surface, ship, and submarine launch. The United States has its own family of hypersonic programs, including the conventional prompt strike system being fielded on Navy destroyers and the Army's Dark Eagle, alongside earlier Chinese systems like the DF-17, which pairs a ballistic booster with a hypersonic glide vehicle. None of those programs are what this video is about, and none of their specs should be assumed to apply to the YJ-20. Every one of these systems has its own airframe, guidance approach, and performance envelope, and mixing them up is a common mistake in casual reporting on this topic. We're mentioning them only to place the YJ-20 test inside a real, ongoing, multi-nation pattern. Militaries around the world are racing to field weapons that compress an adversary's reaction time from minutes to seconds, and every Navy with a serious surface fleet is watching how far that race has gone. RETENTIONCHECKPOINT, about 50% mark. Second hook, reframe the open question. So here's the question this story actually raises, and it's one TWZ's own analysis leaves open. Is this a one-off test of a missile that might end up restricted to a handful of specialized ships, the way some navies test weapons on a lead ship before deciding whether to field them across the fleet? Or is it the first visible sign of a wider rollout across China's destroyer fleet? Based on the reporting summarized here, that isn't known yet, and any answer beyond TWZ assesses it could indicate broader fielding is speculation dressed up as fact. We're not going to do that. What we can say is how this fits into the broader picture of Chinese naval modernization, since that part is well documented across years of open-source defense reporting. Since the early 2010s, the plan has moved from a coastal defense force to a genuine blue water navy, one capable of sustained operations far from Chinese shores, built around large numbers of Type 052D and Type 055 destroyers, a growing carrier program, and an anti-ship missile arsenal designed explicitly around a strategy Western analysts call anti-access/area denial, or A2/AD. The core idea is simple. Instead of trying to match a rival navy hull for hull in a symmetric fight, build enough long-range, hard-to-intercept strike capability that an opposing carrier strike group has to operate at greater risk or greater distance than it otherwise would. Hypersonic anti-ship weapons sit near the top of that wish list, because their speed sharply narrows an adversary's intercept window compared to older subsonic or even supersonic missiles. Here's the part of this likely to generate real disagreement among people who follow naval affairs closely. Putting a top-tier weapon like this on a smaller, more numerous class of ship can be read two different ways. One reading treats it as a sign of confidence, proof that Chinese industry has matured the missile and its launch systems enough that it no longer needs a flagship-class hull. The other reading treats it as a numbers-first strategy, an attempt to make a rival's targeting problem harder by putting a dangerous weapon on more ships, even if each ship's version of the system involves engineering compromises. TWZ's own reporting, as summarized here, leans toward flagging the second interpretation as the more consequential one to watch without treating it as settled. That's the right way to hold this story. Notable, worth tracking, and still short of proof of a fleet-wide rollout. For U.S. and allied naval planners in the Indo-Pacific, the practical takeaway isn't really about this one test. It's about what it would mean if the pattern repeats. Carrier strike groups, destroyer squadrons, and amphibious task forces operating in the Western Pacific and South China Sea already train and plan around Chinese long-range anti-ship missiles fired from aircraft, submarines, and land-based launchers. Hypersonic weapons showing up on a wider slice of the plan's destroyer fleet, not just its largest ships, would mean more Chinese naval formations could pose that same high-end threat. That's exactly the kind of development that shows up in subsequent Pentagon reports to Congress on Chinese military power, and in NATO and allied naval intelligence assessments, well before it shows up in an official plan announcement. There's also a defensive technology angle worth explaining in plain terms, because it's what makes hypersonic anti-ship weapons so disproportionately alarming to naval planners compared to older missiles. Modern shipboard air defense, systems like the U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system paired with interceptors such as the SM-6 works by detecting an incoming threat, calculating an intercept solution, and launching a counter-missile with enough time to close the gap before impact. Every step of that sequence assumes a certain amount of warning time. A missile traveling at several times the speed of sound compresses that warning time dramatically compared to a subsonic or even supersonic threat, sometimes leaving a defending ship's crew a window measured in single-digit seconds rather than the roughly 1 to 2 minutes an older subsonic sea-skimming missile might allow at similar range. That's the underlying reason defense analysts treat any credible expansion of hypersonic anti-ship capability on any Navy's ships as significant, regardless of the political messaging around any one test. So put yourself in the position of an analyst at a Pacific Fleet intelligence shop looking at this same imagery. Does one test on one smaller hull tell you enough to change how you plan for the next 5 years? Or do you wait for a second and third sighting before calling it a trend? That's a genuine open question. And it's worth asking yourself what threshold of evidence should have to be met before a single report like this reshapes a planning assumption. Where this actually stands, as of today, is worth stating plainly. What's confirmed? TWZ reports a test firing of the YJ-20 hypersonic anti-ship missile from a Chinese destroyer smaller than the vessels typically associated with hypersonic-class weapons in plan service. What's analyst interpretation, not confirmed fact? The exact performance specifications of the missile in this configuration, the identity and class of the specific hull involved beyond TWZ's own description, and whether this represents the start of a wider fielding across China's destroyer fleet or a limited, ship-specific trial. There's been no official PLA Navy statement, as reflected in the reporting summarized here, confirming the strategic intent behind the test. Treat any claim about why China did this beyond what TWZ itself assesses as speculation, not established fact. There's a piece of this story we deliberately kept narrow for this video. We're not speculating about which specific destroyer class was involved, because the source material summarized for this report doesn't name one, and inventing a hull number just to sound more specific would be exactly the kind of fabrication a factual channel shouldn't do. If TWZ or another outlet publishes follow-up reporting identifying the class, that's a natural candidate for a follow-up video. Let us know if that's something worth tracking closely. What's still not known and worth being honest about, how widely this capability will actually be fielded, what the missile's real-world range and terminal maneuverability look like outside a controlled test, whether the missile fired in this test carried a full operational payload or a stripped-down test article, and whether Chinese planners see this primarily as a deterrent signal aimed at U.S. and allied planners or as a straightforward capability upgrade with no messaging intent attached. It's also not publicly known, based on the reporting summarized here, how many additional test firings from smaller hulls may have already happened without drawing the same level of open-source attention, or whether this specific event was simply the first one outside analysts managed to identify and document. None of that is public record right now. Anyone telling you they know for certain is guessing. It's worth being just as honest about the limits of open-source defense analysis itself. Outlets like TWZ generally build these assessments from a mix of official statements, satellite or ship-spotting imagery, and pattern recognition built up over years of watching a given Navy's programs, not from classified intelligence. That approach has a strong track record of catching real developments early, but it also means individual details can later get revised as better imagery or additional sourcing turns up. Nothing here should be read as a final word on the YJ-20 program. If you want to verify or follow this story yourself, start with the war zone's own reporting and imagery analysis, since that's the primary source this video draws from. USNI News and Naval News both track planned destroyer and missile developments closely and are worth checking for follow-up confirmation or pushback on TWZ's assessment. The U.S. Department of Defense's annual report to Congress on Chinese military power is the standard government-level reference for how the Pentagon characterizes planned capability growth over time, including anti-ship weapons. It's also worth searching planned destroyer classes directly, the Type 052D and Type 055 programs, to understand the baseline fleet this development sits alongside. RETENTION Payoff plus open loop, final 60s. What this story ultimately comes down to is one verified data point, a hypersonic anti-ship missile fired from a smaller destroyer than expected, sitting next to a much bigger open question about where Chinese naval modernization is headed next. The data point is real. The trend line is still being drawn. We'll keep tracking this one as more reporting comes in, and if TWZ or other outlets confirm a wider rollout, that's the video we'll bring you next.